Communicating with a dying person. Most experts agree that the dying should be told that they are dying. They should be allowed to communicate with their loved ones about their death and reminisce about their life. Conversation should focus on strengths and preparation for the remainder of life. A lot of times, people don't want their loved ones to know that they're dying. But it's only fair to do that because there are things that people want to say when they know that they are dying. Grieving. There's several different dimensions of grieving, but grief is the emotional numbness, disbelief, separation anxiety, despair, sadness, and loneliness that accompany the loss of someone we love. Grief is not a simple emotional state, but it's rather a complex, evolving process with multiple dimensions. One of the dimensions that I mentioned a second ago was the separation anxiety. You would think that as you get older, you wouldn't have that, but that seems to be with you from the time that you were a child straight through to your older years. It is estimated that 80 to 90% of survivors experience normal or uncomplicated grief reactions. By 6 months, loss is accepted as reality. You become more optimistic about the future and function competently in your everyday life. But it takes a while for it to happen. So at 6 months, only 10 to 20% of the survivors have difficulty dealing with loss. So that tells you that the majority, it takes more than 6 months to process everything. Prolonged grief. That's also called complicated grief, and that's the type of grief that evolves during despair and is still unresolved over an extended period of time. A person who loses someone on whom he or she was emotionally dependent is often at greatest risk for developing the prolonged grief. Of individuals diagnosed with complicated grief, 40% reported at least one full or limited system grief-related panic attack in the past week. So it's not easy to get through the loss of someone, and you should not rush through. There is no timetable. You take the time that you need. Disenfranchised grief refers to an individual's grief involving a socially ambiguous loss that can't be openly mourned or supported. For example, a relationship that isn't socially recognized, such as an ex-spouse, or a hidden loss, such as an abortion. Stigmatized circumstances of the death, such as a death from AIDS. So disenfranchised grief may intensify an individual's grief because it cannot be publicly acknowledged. So if you hide the cause of death for fear of what others will say, it's going to take you a bit longer to grieve. Coping with others' death. I started to talk about this earlier, but deaths that are sudden, untimely, violent, or traumatic are likely to have a more intense and prolonged effect on the survivor. Now, I mentioned before that we have coping strategies. Well, the process in this case is much more difficult. It's often accompanied by PTSD, which is the post-traumatic stress disorder, which could be intrusive thoughts, flashbacks to good times, flashbacks to bad times, nightmares, lack of sleep, unable to concentrate, things that just keep you preoccupied. And there is no ideal way to deal with grief. Healthy coping with death involves growth, flexibility, and appropriateness within cultural context. So don't let someone tell you that you shouldn't cry or that you shouldn't remember the good times and smile and laugh. People grieve in different ways. As long as you are expressing your thoughts and feelings, then it's working for you. Now, losing a life partner is a totally different entity in its own. Those left behind after the death of an intimate partner often suffer profound grief and often endure financial loss, loneliness, increased physical illness, and psychological disorders, including depression. A recent study also revealed that widowed individuals who reported higher marital quality subsequently had more symptoms of depression after their spouse died. The bereaved are at increased risk for many health problems, including death. So I don't know if you've noticed, but there are cases where a couple has been married for 60 years and one of the spouses dies, and then within the next 10-15 days, the other one dies. And they call it dying from a broken heart. And that is, I believe, a true phenomenon. Volunteering and helping those behaviors definitely will help the well-being of the widowed individuals. So if you can lend whatever type of support that you can, that would definitely help the person get through the grieving process. And they do have some programs. They have like a widow-to-widow program that provides support for newly widowed women. And that program actually began back in the 60s. So that's been going on for a while. And then there's plenty of different ways that people can mourn. So in the United States in 2015, there were 48.6% of the deaths were followed by a cremation. And that's a significant increase from the cremation rate of 14% back in 1985, and then 20% in 2000. So it is becoming increasingly more common. I guess the trend seems to be that we're moving away from public funerals and displaying an open casket towards a more private funeral or memorial service. So that kind of covers everything that there is to cover when it comes to death, dying, and grieving. The goal of this one chapter and the takeaways that you should have, I'm going to share with you, and hopefully this will help you going forward. So, from lesson 1, we talked about the death system and its cultural and historical context. We evaluated some of the issues in determining death and decisions regarding death. We discussed death and the attitudes around it at different points in development. In the second lesson, we explained or tried to explain the psychological aspects involved in facing one's own death and the context in which people die. and we talked about Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of dying. And then in this lesson, we talked about ways in which we can cope with the death of another person, some of the strategies for communicating with the dying person, and what some of the forms for mourning were. So, based on that, you now have the overview of Chapter 17, and I hope that you walk away with some lessons from this chapter on death, dying, and grieving.